Hello, my friends. Let's talk Nier. The philosophy in Nier is incredibly thick, just like all other aspects of its story. When going to evaluate Nier for my narrative gaming masterpiece series, I took to saying that Nier had complete resonance between its game mechanics and narrative themes. But I asserted this without really defending why it was the case. Well, that's exactly what I want to do now. But like I said, this is a really thick game, so I'm going to split this video into a series of 3 or 4 parts to really make that deep dive. And by the end of these parts, I hope that we're going to reach the point where we've explored the themes enough to concretely nail down what I could call the philosophy of Nier. The first theme of Nier is that language begets power. And this theme can be traced back even to the first Drakengard in how the protagonist Kaim gives up his voice to form a pact with Angelus the dragon and obtain crazy powers from doing so. The first and most apparent example of this is the sealed verses. In searching for a cure for Yona's illness, we switch from looking for lunar tear flowers, which are completely useless by the way, to looking for magic spells that Grimoire Weiss has forgotten, in hopes that one of them can provide a magic cure. Not only do they never provide this cure, but these verses are almost exclusively attacks, different ways to punch, stab, saw, and slash at the bad guys. P.S. The shades are referred to as Mamono in Japanese, which literally translates to bad things. And the main enemy, the Shadow Lord, is just Mao in Japanese, which translates to the Bad King. The name was a little forced, but good thing the rest of the game is more subtle. But point is, the sealed verses are designed to beat up bad guys, or at least the bad guys from the perspective of Nier. The way we obtain those verses are by destroying bosses, which are larger, more powerful shades, who make up most of the enemies in the game, except for the robots which seem to control the same abilities as shades but are fundamentally different beings from them. But I guess we have to wait until Nier Automata to know what's up with these guys, cause the original game really doesn't have much about them. I'm gonna make a prediction right now that the clunky industrial robots in Automata are, like the ones we see in Nier, going to be revealed as being fully and completely sapient intelligences. It's pretty obvious. So you could say that by defeating these bosses, we are taking their power from them when we claim the sealed verses. The sealed verses are also not the only time we claim words to become more powerful. When killing normal shades and robots, we obtain words that can be assigned to further boost our attacks, our movement, our magic, and other stats, to supplement the RPG leveling that happens normally. Even the sound effect of these words being picked up sounds like a little excerpt of speech in a different language. The Black Scrawl, which is regarded as a sort of disease by the people in this far-flung future apocalypse, the scrawl is most predominantly displayed to us when we see it crawling around Kaine's bandaged up arm. It is later revealed that this scrawl is actually a shade named Tyron, which has possessed Kaine's body. This is what gives Kaine her superpowers and allows her to seek revenge against the shade that killed her grandma. However, it comes at the cost of competing for dominance and control over her body with the shade. I hope you took notes on that little part, because Tyron and Kaine are going to be really important in the future videos. As another point, weakness is always found to accompany difficulty with speaking or the inability to speak and communicate. Yona is the prime example. Sickly and on the brink of death, her character is defined by frailty, in spite of her uncanny force of will to try to help and find a cure for herself. Yona too is possessed by the Black Scrawl, but in her case the power of her body was being fed to something else. Yona found her power and will in reading books from the library. Again, books being mediums to convey language to other people. There is also the New Game Plus Plus mode where we get to play through the second half of the game again. Only this time we get subtitles to translate and understand the words being spoken by the bosses and enemies we killed before. This mode allows us to see the events of the game from their perspective. Thanks to our character retaining his levels and power, we get to see that it was in fact our player running in, attacking them, and not even giving them a chance to speak. This shows us that not possessing the language needed to communicate and be understood by Nier made them frail and weak, and as a result, they died by our hands. The city of Facade also presents an example of this. Being presented as a city with far too many laws, their entire culture and way of life is based on these hundreds of thousands of rules that are taken as gospel and never taken off the books once written. And while it may seem like an excess of rules, modern societies tend to have way more laws than this city does. Fira tries to explain that the laws do not bind the people of Facade, however, but instead set them free. And in a way, this makes some sense. With a law that stops people from murdering you, you are thus made free to live as you see fit. A law that stops you from telling someone where they have to live and what job they have to do allows that person to choose those things for themselves. Language can be used to bind you from taking freedom away from others, and in being bound in that way, you are in turn guaranteed your own freedom from being taken by others. But if you want the freedom to take freedom from someone else, then you don't actually have any freedom, because it can always be taken away from you, and thus the only occupation of your life is bound to making sure no one binds you. I know that sounded confusing. It is a bit of a paradox, but it makes sense. Language can create law, and laws can create freedom. But the key word is can, and the way Facade is set up will definitely be revisited, because the way they set up their laws don't necessarily give their people that freedom. Believe it or not, there are still far more examples of language begetting power in this game, but I think this is enough to make my point. However, there is another question that must be asked. If language begets power, then what is power? I'll be tackling how Nier answers that question in part 2. So thank you for joining me, everyone, and as always, stay true. Hello my friends, let's talk Nier. Last time we talked about Nier's theme of how language begets power, and ended on the question of what is power, and what does Nier assert that power is. I believe Nier asserts that power is control, but not in the way we normally think about control. However, to start looking at this theme, I think I need to start by looking at its more traditional example. And for that, I'll look at the city of Facade. The city of too many laws that prompted our discussion last time of how laws that bind action can actually ensure a person's freedom. But the operative word was can, and that doesn't mean all laws will. Facade had laws that dictated where shops had to be located in an absolutely irrational setup. Laws that required people to live at an altitude that reflects their social class, and other more or less offensive laws that range from inconvenient to outright discrimination. The town guard, too, is restricted from doing their job when the king goes missing because of two conflicting laws that say the guards must immediately search everywhere when the king goes missing, but only the king is allowed to go into the palace. The inability to do both of those things should be immediately apparent. So Facade has an interesting take on legalism, which is the idea that laws are inherently the source of goodness and morality, and denies that idea as well. But normally legalism is criticized for giving the lawgivers, the king, the presidents, the senates, whatever you have, the ability to dominate the people of a society without themselves being bound to those laws. In Facade, the king is not the lawgiver, but is as bound to the laws as everyone else. And the laws seem to be created democratically. They just don't have any way to remove a law once it's been made. So, to tie this back to power, the control and dominance of power controls the king, the person who wields that power, as much as anyone else. The most prominent show of power in Nier, however, is magic and the sealed verses. Our character wields massive powers to beat up bad guys, and gets even more power for each bad guy he beats up. But, in spite of all these powers, they don't seem to help our character accomplish any of his goals. Grimoire Vice's magic is good for defeating big monsters, but not good for finding a cure for his daughter's illness, not good for protecting his friends and daughter from the Shadow Lord. When he tries to save the Aerie from being attacked by the Shades, he and Emile end up annihilating the whole village instead. And yet none of this seems to stop this guy from trying to solve every problem with a giant blood fist of justice. Our character has the sense that he's gone too far. He has no choice and no other options than to pulverize his enemies, and he expresses this most significantly during two moments. The first is when he comforts Emile after turning the Aerie into dust with a magical nuclear bomb. He lost control while trying to use his power against some giant eyeball with scales. Emile is sobbing for killing all those innocents, and our character's only way to console him is to say, "Just don't look back." Second is when we finally confront the Shadow Lord, and our main character is finally confronted with the reality that the Shadow Lord, the character from the intro tutorial, is doing exactly what we are, trying to use his power, gained from Grimoire Noir, to save the life of his daughter, by putting her shade into the body of the replicant that's supposed to be her match. I hope you took notes on that part as well, because that's also going to be important in a later video. Long story short, our character decides on the spot that he's not going to sympathize with the Shadow Lord. Just like he told Emile, he wouldn't look back. He had only one option, and that was to use his power to smash his way forward to get what he wanted. And guess what? It didn't work. The only reason he gets his daughter back is because the Shadow Lord's Yona decided to empathize with our Nier. She decides to give up her control. I think I've almost made my point, but real quick, I want to add a personal experience that I had with Nier. This was the first time I was ever profoundly affected by Nier, and by a mechanic as metaphor. See, my first experience of Nier was Nier Replicant, which I got from a video store bargain bin in Soshigaya, Japan. I couldn't read Japanese, still can't, but I can hear it all right. So my last year of university, I spent an arduous amount of time playing this game, only getting a fraction of it, but still fascinated. During the second boss fight in the Aerie, there is a section where shades are possessing the villagers who were finally starting to open up to outsiders thanks to our good old boys. There is a ton of confusion as to who are the normal villagers versus the shades, who were the real guards versus imposters. And while fighting in the marketplace, you can actually hit and kill the guards. I originally didn't know these were also shades, but you technically can get past this stage without attacking the guards at all. In thinking I was accidentally murdering innocent guards while aiming for the shades, I played this portion dozens of times, trying not to kill a single guard. But I couldn't. The weapon attacks, the magic, all were just too large and powerful to both attack the shades and protect the guards. It was this moment that made me first look at Nier as a narrative about power, and what it meant for me to be controlling, or perhaps being controlled by, all the power that my character was wielding. And as a side note, since I have no place for an elegant transition for this little tidbit, the name of the shade that possesses Kaine becomes a black scroll and gives Kaine her power, is called Tyrann, which is German for tyrant, meaning a terrible and oppressive monarch. So Kaine's source of power is also a source that is controlling or manipulating her. This theme in Nier is essentially a denial of Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy on the will to power. The will to power is the idea that every aspect of human psychology is, from an underlying need, to control what is around you. It comes in two forms: Kraft, which is pure force, physical strength that can be used by anything that possesses it, and Macht, which is the conscious channeling of Kraft into the creation of social structure. Nietzsche believed that this nihilist abandoning of ethics to instead focus on human nature as a power-driven thing would free people from being bound to a sense of absolute morality that oppresses people arbitrarily. But in reality, his denial of any grounded base for ethics normally results in either people who already have power asserting that they have a right to oppress others, because they are the Übermensch, a person who threw off their slave morality by imposing their will on others, while common people who don't have much power in society turn instead to dismissiveness and hedonistic focus on whatever the next personally or immediately pleasurable thing that comes up is. But again, Nier denies Nietzsche's depiction of people's relationship to power. No person can actually wield power. Power wields people. The lesson in this mechanic and in this part of Nier's themes is that power is control, but people can never actually control power. Power to any degree controls us. It dictates what we do. It dictates our options and our thoughts. Whether you're the king of a nation or just a guy in a village, our power controls us. So power is control, and that control is exercised over all people. But now Nier raises another question with that theme, and that's the question of what are people? For what Nier says about that, come back for part 3. Thank you for watching, everyone, and as always, stay true. Hello, my friends, let's talk Nier. In my last 2 videos, I talked about 2 of Nier's narrative themes on our way to understanding the philosophy of Nier. Last time was the theme of power as control, but it is a control that oppresses both those who wield the power and those who are subject to it by taking the freedom away from both. Power is its own entity. It cannot actually be wielded or controlled. Power controls all people. But that raises the question of another one of Nier's themes. What are people? This time the subject is a bit more nuanced in how Nier presents the idea, so I'm afraid I'm going to hide the prestige for a while, and just get right into my points, so hopefully by the end, you'll understand where I'm coming from. The first is that there are multiple kinds of sentient beings in this game's universe. The kind of being that we play as through most of the game are replicants. These bodies were meant to be replacement bodies for shades that retained their individual consciousness. Problem was, once they made these bodies, it turned out that they weren't empty vessels like those silly scientists expected. The replicants had their own consciousness and resisted being possessed by shades. So let's move on to the shades, who were originally called gestalts by the Japanese government, which were created when touching Grimoire Noir. It's actually a pretty interesting name. The word gestalt means when your mind connects pieces of an image to make a whole. It can close gaps, combine images that aren't combined, create images out of empty space, and a bunch of other tricks our brains play when they try to see 3-dimensional space in 2-dimensional images. The design of the shades reflects this, and their bodies are comprised of 2D sheets that wrap and move in 3D space to create the shape of a humanoid body. See, touching Grimoire Noir not only turns humans into shades, but also turns them into mindless slaves. Weiss and the other books were designed to create gestalts, but not the mind control aspect of them. However, these books still made it so that the shades would eventually relapse into mindless zombie shadows. Only problem was that the only person who managed to keep his mind was Gestalt Nier. His daughter, Gestalt Yona, was not so lucky. But a relapsing Gestalt can overcome their relapse by possessing their own replicant. So, yeah, you would never have guessed Nier was actually a zombie game. Needless to say, the grimoires are also sapient beings. Next are the automatons, which are all those clunky robots on Robot Mountain, which was called Junk Heap in the English game, but my memory is still Roboyama from the Japanese, so whatever, I'm weird. What's going on with their consciousness? I don't know. Maybe we learn more about that in Nier Automata, I'm hoping we do, and by the time you're watching this, I'm probably already playing that game, so I'll get you an answer eventually. Come back to the channel later for that video. There are also the androids. Yep, there are androids that are a different category in this world. So obviously the main characters in Nier Automata are androids, but the twin sisters, Devila and Popola, are also androids in the original Nier. The purpose of androids in the original Nier was to watch and manage the replicant society until they were ready to be possessed by shades. But since Gestalt Nier was mainly pushing to save his daughter, and as a result kinda fell into Grimoire Noir's plan to enslave all of humanity and the replicants, these android babes ended up just becoming his reluctant servants. Also, side note, if you take a wolf and put it through the Gestalt process, it apparently becomes sapient too, so that's neat. That covers about all my bases, so I'm going to move on. Point number 2 is that knowing all that, it's time to get into the real nitty-gritty, and not just a demonstration that I understand the different factions at work in Nier's story. In truth, the story's themes don't really treat these different factions of sapient beings as being fundamentally different than any other. The sympathetic New Game Plus Plus that lets you read the subtitles of all the different bosses you face is evidence that the game means to demonstrate the similarities of their inner workings over the differences in their bodies. If you are expecting a detailed dive into each of those categories and their nuanced differences that make them each a special flower that misunderstands the other, sorry to disappoint you. But you're welcome for all the time I just saved you on some other video. The Shades are humans. They've lost their bodies, and they've lost their minds. They've lost free will. But they did retain something. The one thing that they have retained is their voice. The language and the memories of their time as humans. When we defeat enemies in this game, we are strengthened by absorbing their words, their voice, and their language. When a shade invades a human body, as they have done with both Kaine and Yona, they become the Black Scroll. Whatever semblance of a body they had left is now purely magical language in the form of moving text. The human has become language. And as a side note, the kanji characters that spell Kaine's name translate to broken sound, showing metaphorically that Kaine is also language. Hence the first New Game Plus mode, which is a novelette of Kaine's backstory. The memories and the sensibilities of the grimoires are also tied to the sealed verses, and this is demonstrated in both the scene where Grimoire Weiss is first introduced and can't remember anything about his past, and the scene where Grimoire Noir absorbs Weiss's powers, making him listless and dumb. Society and law, literature and science, all creations of humanity are created in using and refining language. The replicants, the robots, the androids, the grimoires, they are all products of that language. Hell, this game even took out a huge chunk of time to tell mini-stories in novelette format with no visuals at all in Sleeping Beauty, the tree-shaped supercomputer that saves the memories of Gestalts for when they move into replicant bodies. The final theme of Nier should be pretty apparent for anyone who is following along. It's the idea that people are defined by language. And with that, we have all of the pieces that we need to sum up what the philosophy of Nier is. So join me in the next part when we take each of these themes and translate them into a definitive philosophy of Nier. Thank you for watching, everyone, and stay true. Hello my friends, let's talk Nier. In the last 3 parts of this series, I expressed a number of individual themes in the game, and the moments of gameplay, story, and world building in Nier that expressed those themes. Drawing from the lore that surrounds the game, the narrative elements in the game, and my own experiences of playing the game. And as you might have guessed, each of these themes fit together to create one overarching philosophy about the human condition. Language begets power. Power controls and oppresses people, and people are defined by and made of language. Thus, we see a vicious and tragic cycle form. Nier defines the human condition as one that will always inevitably create its own oppression and eventually destruction, because we are powerful, because we can communicate, because we fail to communicate, we must die. In Grimoire Nier, the companion book wherein the game's developers include much of the story that surrounds the game, Yoko Taro describes how, no matter what ending you get, the result is going to spell the death of everyone. If the gestalts are able to fuse with their replicants, the bodies will eventually succumb to the Black Scrawl. If they don't, the gestalts will all relapse, and eventually be killed by the replicants. But the replicants only reproduce by a new copy being made from their parallel gestalt. Thus, all the replicants will eventually die as well. I think for this reason, Kaine is my favorite character in the game, because she is possessed by a shade that is not her own. She lives out the philosophy of the game in Fast Forward. She becomes dominated by the power of Tyrion right before our eyes. And even when she overcomes this, and Tyrion grows to respect and support Kaine, the same situation is bound to play out. Whether she chooses to sacrifice herself or not, the ultimate end of Kaine, and of all the Gestalt and replicants, is that they will completely end. It's just a matter of sooner or later. But there is something beyond the ultimate fate of the replicants and the Gestalts, because there are sapient entities that don't get caught in this cycle. The robots and the androids developed emotions and feelings from being exposed to these humans, but aren't pulled by these same factors. They have free and rational minds, and once their programmed purpose is ended with the end of the humans, they will be left to their own devices. And I suppose their fate and the nature of their existence in a post-humanist world will be a philosophy to be found in Nier Automata. Also, as a fun side note, Emil is also practically immortal, so his presence in the new game might be pretty important too. With that, I will gladly bring this analysis to a close. Going through Nier thoroughly has been an absolute pleasure, and while its ultimate lesson is very bleak, I think I can take solace in the fact that Yoko Taro purposefully creates tragedies to offset all the happy endings we find in other games. The philosophy of Nier describes an aspect of humanity, but it doesn't describe all of humanity. And I think that our option to avoid this sort of fate is signified in Gestalt Yona's decision to leave that cycle of power and oppression, as long as we do so before it's too late. I think I better stop myself here before I end up rambling on too long, but just for self-aggrandizement, let me repeat the philosophy of Nier in its short tag. Language begets power. Power controls and suppresses people, and people are defined by and made of language, creating a horribly tragic cycle. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video and any part of this series, please support me by hitting subscribe and consider dropping by my Patreon page. All links are in the doobly-doo. And don't expect it for a little while, but a philosophical analysis of Nier Automata is already in the works. I'll see you all next time, and, as always, stay true.